Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Alyssa Sangster, CEO of Forte Foundation, a nonprofit that wants to see more women leading. Through education, role models, professional networks, and leadership training, Forte shows women how to build the credibility, skills, network, and confidence to thrive as leaders and change the status quo. Alyssa brings extensive knowledge of issues affecting women's abilities to seek, prepare for, and attain leadership positions that's drawn from her prior experience as Assistant Dean and Director of the MBA program at the Macomb School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. And she joins us today to talk about how universities can improve their leadership development programs for women and people of color. Alyssa, welcome to the program.
Hi, nice to be with you, Drum. Thank you.
My pleasure. Glad to have you here. This is going to be a very fascinating topic for me and for our listeners, talking about women and minorities in higher ed leadership positions. Before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you come into this? And, you're not with a university now, you're with your own company. So tell us a little bit about you and it.
Sure. I started in higher education probably 28, 30 years ago, somewhere in there, where I took my first role at Texas A&M University in admissions for the business school and moved over to University of Texas at Austin a few years after that, where I became the assistant dean for the MBA program and really was responsible for everything from admissions through student services and alumni relations. And so we were just a great MBA program experience for 10 years. And as a part of my role at UT Austin, the dean asked me if I would consider being a part of a task force that was looking at some research and how we could build a better pipeline of women into business leadership and also into business school and looking at kind of enrollments there. So that's how I ended up taking this role at Forte. That working group ultimately became the nonprofit called Forte Foundation, and that's what I am now the CEO of, and I've been there for about 18 years doing this work.
So after 18 years, have you got it right? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we figured it all out. I mean, we're done. So there's nothing really left.
So what are the three takeaways? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Presidents, if you do this, then.
Right.
Well, that's a fascinating background. Obviously, it sets you up very well for what you're doing now with Forte. We've heard for years, there is a case for diversity of leadership, diversity of thought, etc. Tell us a little bit about that so our listeners can understand where we're coming from on this.
Sure. There's so many different approaches to why it's important. One kind of cheeky approach is, why are we even having to talk about and justify a business case for women when they're half the population? It's just important that in this day and time that we acknowledge that everybody has something to give and that everybody is potential for leadership, and how we get and give all of those opportunities to women, to minorities, to men. It should be the same, and it should be something that we're all paying attention to. And if there are roadblocks and hurdles along the way for any of those people, what is it we can do to open up those pathways? I think the business case is important to kind of reiterate, especially if somebody hasn't heard the business case. But where we see in the corporate world that making a big impact is around the return on investment, the return on equity. So when you look at firms that have significant female leadership, you see them performing better. The bottom line is different. You see that those teams and those leaders are better at problem solving, and you see that they make better business decisions. And some of that is just a factor of diversity of thought and diversity in decision making. That research has been out there for decades. And I think that's why at the leadership level, that's where many of the decisions are made. So you need diversity at the top in order to make the best decisions.
Well, isn't it too that Diversity of thought's important, being able to approach it, but women make decisions differently than men. They tend to be more inclusive, which is something very important in higher ed.
Yeah, it is. And I think across higher ed, I think you need to see the women in those decision-making roles so that you can have a different kind of leader. It's not that one is better or that much different. It's just that bringing them all together and giving them opportunities across the board, you're going to see better decisions being made. There's risk aversion, and then there's risk tolerance, and there's no risk consideration at all. And you don't want to apply those liberally to one gender or the other, but I think that predominantly women do have more risk aversion. They're going to slow things down a little bit. Men are going to move things a little bit faster. So I think it does provide balance, and it means it keeps you as an institution out of some of those danger zones.
Oh, I think you're right, but we can both provide examples of women who have moved very decisively and had to. I mean,
Sure.
Naveen Megahead from Lewis University, she took over 10 years ago, and they were looking at closing the school down. And she came in, said, we need to make these cuts, these cuts, these cuts. Faculty weren't happy, but said, we need to save the school.
Right.
I mean, there's an example of moving very quickly when you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I don't mean risk tolerance in slow decision making. I just mean that there's an assessment of all of the good and the bad. And I think that's an example of someone who moved in, and you can be decisive, but you knew exactly what you needed to do to pull things back in order to make a good future for the university.
And now, when you're talking about higher ed and ROI for higher ed, we're really talking about graduation rates, student performance, graduates being workforce ready, things along those lines. Have you seen any research, or have you noticed any difference between men leaders, women leaders, and those type of things?
So I think there was an article that was published in Research in Higher Education, and it was saying that female instructors have a significant positive effect on female student grade performance and do not have a statistically significant effect on male student performance. So having women in the classroom was really going to impact the young women in that classroom in a positive way, but it wasn't going to negatively affect the young men in those classrooms. And so I think, just again, seeing is believing. And so women faculty members being in front of that classroom, it's good for young women. And we know that there's a lot of young women in college and on university campuses today. So I think it's important to have that reflection in the faculty.
I think you're right. And it's interesting. Women leaders have a positive impact on women students, things like that, and no difference with their men counterparts. But the men don't have the same positive effect on women.
Right.
And, no change with men identifying with men. That is interesting.
Yeah. It's for the women, it is exciting to have someone that kind of maybe thinks like you, sees the world the way you see it, and is that role model. And maybe the women do in the faculty ranks connect well with those students in the classroom. My own story is I've had a lot of men in my life who have made big impacts on me, especially in like high school English class, which is why I became, an English major. And that continued into the university world. But when I started connecting with women in those college classrooms who were thinking about the world from a gender perspective, they were bringing up points that maybe some of my male faculty members had never thought to bring up because it wasn't their own experience. It just made the whole learning so much richer and so much different than it was when it was a man in the classroom. And I, of course, I'm all for everybody being there, but I think we need to make special attention to what's going on with gender in the classroom. And if we aren't seeing that reflection, although I do think we are seeing a good number of women in the faculty ranks, I think what you're trying to, get at a little bit with this podcast is like, how are we seeing that change move up the pipeline? So maybe they're reflected in the day-to-day classroom experience, but maybe they're not in those tenured faculty positions. Maybe they're not in the administration within those colleges, or maybe they're not at the very top as presidents or deans. And how can we make sure that that pathway is still open to women?
I think you make a really good point there, and that is one of the challenges, of course. I remember working with a board, and a lot of my work has to do with boards of directors and trustees, etc. And the school was lamenting why they weren't attracting more minority students of color. And you take a look at their board, and their board was all men, all white. The majority of them were, 50, 60 plus years old. There was one Hispanic member of the board. It's like, folks, all you have to do is look in the mirror, and this is why.
Right.
You didn't have a lot of, in fact, there were no women instructors, faculty members. They were all in support roles. It was a Christian university, and this is, part of their belief system, but the way you enroll students of color, the way you enroll any student, is the student has to identify with the people that they see.
Right. I think you see that playing out in so many different ways. And it's hard to even think outside of that box if you don't have that voice at the table. And so if you're not seeing that diversity in the boardroom, then when the question is asked, how do we find more students of color? How do we find more women? It's very difficult for that group to come up with the answers because it's not their life experience, and it's just not what they see the world being. Doesn't mean they might come up with a couple of good ideas, but I think having a diverse reflection in that boardroom is so important. And if you don't, and you're just getting started and trying to make a change and do something that is maybe in line with a vision or a mission for your university, but you don't have the reflection, I think the first step is going out and figuring out where you're going to find those people that you can bring onto the board. And I know that a board is a very comfortable space, and you need it to be somewhat comfortable, but you also need some difference in opinions, and you need to be able to have a group that's comfortable pushing back. So I would also say, if you're in that situation, don't just go find one that's going to answer your questions, one Hispanic, one Black, one woman. You need to give them the power in the room to be able to feel like they can push back, and that they're not just there as a token, but they are there because you truly want to see change happen. And that might mean giving up a little bit of your power and your privilege, which is sometimes uncomfortable. And I'll stop there, but I'll also say there's a whole pathway for going out and finding the right students and understanding which places to seek those student prospects. And it sometimes is hard to figure out where those places are if you've never had people tell you about that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let's dig a little more deeply into women leadership in universities.
Sure.
When we were talking last week, we chatted a little bit about differences between men and women applying for a position, making job descriptions more open. I don't want to call them gender neutral.
Yes.
But, things along those lines. What are some of the things that universities can do to start building a supportive atmosphere for women in leadership positions?
First, I'll say I was mentioning, that universities are doing a pretty good job. And some of the data that I saw from 2020 out of American Association of University Professors was that women are about 43% of full-time tenured or tenured track faculty. They're about 54% of full-time non-tenured track professors. So that's well represented. And then women account for only about 33% of full professors. And as we know, that's the tenured group. That's the group that gets a lot of the benefits at the university. That's the group that gets the extra support. They have reduced classroom time, the perks of being a full professor. So I think that's kind of the microcosm we're looking at. Like, what is it we can do to not only recruit the best, but also make sure that you retain them and see them move up into those full tenure professors?
Mm-hmm. Is retaining these senior women, is that an issue?
Well, I don't have a number on retention, so it may not be that it's retention, but it may be that some of them are going into the non-tenure track versus the tenure track, and there may be a reason for that. I mean, retention is important, right? Because you invest a lot as a university in a faculty member if they're on that tenure track. A lot of research dollars, a lot of support. And so I would imagine ideally you want to see them move into a tenure track faculty position because you've invested that money in them. So I think that the question then becomes, how do you make sure that happens? And that's the whole retention process. If you see a large group of men and women in the early assistant professorship roles, just like in the business world, if they're all coming in and they're at the manager level, but by the time you get to the senior VP level and the C-suite, they've all dwindled and the population has gone from 50-50 to 70-30 or 80-20, then something's happening to that other population that has to be addressed or looked at if your end game is equal representation at the top.
Yeah. And that's really what I want to focus on is what are the things that institutions need to do to support it so that we get that 50-50. And in fact, right now there's more women in higher ed than there are men as far as students go.
Right.
We're not representative of that in the faculty ranks and administrators, senior administrators.
Right. Right. So, and I think there's a lot of debate about what to do about that in the university space, right, for the student population, because that switch happened somewhere in the 90s. I think we've seen for the last 20, 25 years that's been the case, that women outnumber men in those undergraduate ranks. And so, and then at the faculty level and at the senior faculty level and in administration, you're not seeing those numbers. So I think some of the things that can be done, a few kind of tips, I guess, would be looking at the job descriptions that you're posting out there for faculty, making sure that that language that you use is reflective of both of words and meanings that are appealing to both men and to women, and that you might tamper some of the language that is traditionally interesting to men versus to women in terms of what they're looking for in their careers.
For example?
What we see is a more aggressive language or the more competitive language, that it's not that you don't want women to be competitive, but they immediately see that and they think this may not be the environment for me if that's the way it is. If it's cutthroat or challenging all the time, they may think, well, that may not be right for me. Maybe I'll go over here and try this. But just really thinking, it's not a drastic shift, but it's just looking through your job descriptions and making sure there's lots of websites that you can go to. There are organizations that give you tips on how to make a gender neutral job description. It's very much the rage these days. So there's places that you can get some advice or consulting on that. I think also looking for people where they are. So if you're thinking you want to hire more Black candidates or Latino candidates, where do you go to find those students, those PhD candidates? And if you're only looking in the same places you've always looked, then you may not be finding a diverse pipeline of talent that you can then evaluate and determine who you're going to bring into your university. So broaden that scope, make sure that you've included other sources for that talent than maybe you did in the past. The other thing is really looking at how you support those candidates when they come into your university. And so thinking about what is your goal, your outcome for them. We know that this generation, especially that's out there, the Gen Z population, they're really interested in having things be transparent and knowing more about what is their career path here. How are you going to support me? Where do you want to see me in 10 years? And I think being very clear with them about what your expectations are is something that you should consider. And that may mean that you're going to give them extra support once they start writing or doing their research to be approved for tenure track faculty. You might have, for the women, say, we know this is a time when there's a lot of things going on in your life, and we're going to give you access to additional teaching assistants or graduate assistants while you're writing your research. And I think there's sponsorship and mentorship is something else that we should consider. The difference there is when you're a mentor, you're advising that person kind of face to face, but when you're a sponsor, you're advocating for them behind closed doors. So if you're the department chair or one of the leadership team in a college, that you're actually sponsoring the faculty, that you actually going into that room and actually being that representative, that voice for them when they're not there to defend themselves, defend their research, defend their extra work that they're doing as a faculty member. and make sure that you've created those very formal sponsor relationships for the candidates within that college.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that thing we were just talking about, the research. One institution that I know, every faculty member who comes in as part of their research tenure track, etc., not the adjuncts per se, but full-time faculty are expected to have a research portfolio, especially at this being an R1. And what they do is they have a how to write a research grant class that all faculty go through. And we met with a number of the research faculty and talking about, and they all said that this was incredibly helpful for them. And they actually, their first time out as a PI, the primary investigator, they had somebody walking them through the application. They do a lot of NIH grants, etc. It was very helpful for them.
Yeah, and I think that there can be this idea that maybe, I didn't have that course, or nobody held my hand while I walked through this process. So why should we do something like that for these new faculty members? But I think that's a beautiful example of leveling the playing field and giving everybody access to the information and taking the best of what your current faculty have to offer, the tips and the tricks and the insights on how to make this process successful, and giving it in a format where every new faculty member can take advantage of that. I think it's a perfect example of how to make this retention piece work within your faculty ranks and give them that support that they need. It's ultimately good for the university and the colleges to see all of their faculty members succeed. And I know it's a competitive environment where you're trying to always get the best and better opportunities, but I think that leveling the playing field really does help everyone.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that companies outside higher ed are doing that can carry over into higher ed to support, women and minorities coming up through the ranks?
Yeah, I think a plan and really, developing a promotion plan, a investment in these people, their own professional development, thinking about when are those critical times along this journey as they move toward full professorship. How can we invest in all of our faculty in a bigger and better way? Looking back at the research around how have your previous faculty members performed? Are you seeing across the scope, the underrepresented faculty member, the women faculty member, are they performing at the same rate? What do they tell you is the roadblock or the problem if they're not performing at that same rate? Listening to those faculty and building these development plans that help support them as they go through this process. I think that's what companies are trying to do. I'm not saying they're all successful at this point, but they are really thinking about this hurdle. There's some McKinsey data from their Women in the Workplace study that really looks at how the first 4 to 5 years goes for men and women and underrepresented employees. And it shows this progression and where the men increase and where the women decrease, and how as you move toward those more senior ranks, those numbers shift and switch. And so knowing like the first 4 years, the first time the employees go into a managerial role, that's called this broken run phenomenon, because the women don't get promoted at the same rate that the men do. And that means that almost immediately the men are on a higher trajectory towards leadership because the women are stalling out in that first managerial role. So what can companies and what could universities learn from this is to pay attention at that very early stage, because almost immediately there are probably challenges to continuing to progress along that research path.
Yeah. Higher ed is notorious for not training their leaders. They do not do a good job. And what you just mentioned, having leadership development plans for faculty, for other folks coming up through the ranks, is something you typically see at the higher levels in corporations. You don't normally see them unless someone is identified as a high performer, something like that. So having that is a really good idea. The other piece with that, with women, their career trajectories being a little bit different. What about doing leadership courses where you're teaching people leadership, things like that? Higher ed doesn't do a good job. I know of a few institutions who do it, but not many.
Well, I know, and it's interesting because almost always there are courses, professional development, executive education courses being taught all over a university. At every college, there's usually some kind of executive education happening, yet their very own leaders that are there, they never really invest and send them over into these courses. And there's just so much to be gained and learned from that interaction with other people out in industry or at other universities. And so really, I think it's a good suggestion that they consider what's available even on their own campus to give these professionals that training. We have something called Male Allies. It kind of is created in a couple of different iterations, but it's allies for gender equity and for men and for women to come together and to really talk about that and to have these very frank conversations about what it feels like, what it looks like, how it plays out in their personal lives and their professional lives. That's an example of something that could easily be helpful in terms of focusing on the issues that exist in that pipeline. But, so many different opportunities that universities have to give that kind of training.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it all starts with the student. If you don't have visible women, minority leaders, you're not going to attract the students that look like that. We all attract to, similar to what we already are.
Right.
And so if we go back to the purpose of the university, which is a higher purpose,
right,
it's preparing students for careers, for their lives.
Right.
But you can't do that. It's a diverse workforce. And if you don't have diverse students, diverse faculty, how do you prepare them for diversity?
Right. Well, I'll give a couple of examples about how we've been dealing with some of this in the business school, and it might just be an example for other colleges to think about. But we've done a lot of work with our partners, university partners, to create a class profile for MBA programs that looks more equitable. And so we've gone from 25% women to 42% women. As those women began to show up in the business school classroom, you have to ask yourself, you look around and you say, well, are our faculty diverse? Or are we bringing a diverse student population into a classroom where the faculty that are teaching them are not diverse? And the downside to that is not just that there's not more women for the women to see, but it's also that there's not more women for the men to see. And as they're going out into the corporate world, the nature of business is changing and shifting. Your business school is a place where they're being trained as a leader to go out and run business. And you want them to have this experience where they're seeing both men and women leading. We want to see how women are answering the hard questions and how women are thinking about the future just as much as you want to hear about men. And so I think we've been seeing some faculty members work with students to really look at the inclusivity of their classrooms. So when they bring in 50-50 women and men, how are they talking in the classroom? How are they representing the speakers who come forward and talk about their experiences in the business world? How are they representing their stories to those students? Is it a gender balance? Are the faculty thinking about who they call on in the classroom? Is their default always to go to the person that looks like them and thinks like them? Or are they purposefully thinking about bringing in different kinds of opinions, maybe contrarian opinions, maybe someone who never has asked a question the entire class? Maybe they do have something to say. So are you making sure that you call on them and really just trying to diversify that conversation? So I think there's just so much that can be done if faculty are actively thinking about what's that experience? Who am I missing? Who am I leaving out of this conversation? I think that would go a long way if faculty were willing to do that in their classroom.
And that comes to implicit bias, things along those lines, having case studies where there are both men, women, people of color as the protagonist,
right?
The savior for the company or whatever it is,
right?
So
yeah, we're seeing we actually support a case writing competition that is looking for cases that have women as the protagonist, so that there are more of them available. Because of course, a case study it's not just about the protagonist. It's also got to be about the teaching notes and about whether or not the concepts you're teaching are actually illustrated well, because a faculty member doesn't want to teach a bad case just to make sure there's a female protagonist in it. So you've got to have more cases written. But we went out and did audits, and we looked at the top MBA programs and what cases they were teaching. And when you looked at those core classes, it was about 15-20% women protagonists in those cases versus 80% men. But there also weren't enough cases in the library of cases to even choose from for all of the different topics that you need them for. So there's, again, an imbalance of the case writing, the people who write the cases thinking about this. So any incentive you can give on the front end to encourage them to write a female protagonist case study is also very, that helps.
So much to do, so little time.
Yes, I say it's like not a glass ceiling, it's the glass onion, and we're just peeling those layers back one at a time, and there's always another layer, it seems. So
I like that.
Yeah.
Alyssa, this has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed our conversation. As we wrap up, 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
Sure. I think, kind of what we've covered has been the pipeline and looking at your hiring policies, your job descriptions, thinking about whether or not you have a comprehensive plan for recruiting diverse talent into your pipeline, and really thinking about how to remove that unconscious bias that affects any hiring decisions. And there's a lot of layers there, just like I said, in order to get that right. And you're not going to do it right the first time, but any attempt you make to kind of shore that up is going to be good for your pipeline. I would also say, thinking about that throughput, what is that classroom experience like? Are they inclusive? Are they intentionally designed for a diverse student population? Who is feeling left out? Who's getting 100% for what they're paying? Is every student getting the access and the opportunity, the inspiration, the role models, everything they need? That's a tall order for a university, but I think it's important as the leaders of these academic institutions to be thinking about every single student and what's 100% going to look like to them when they walk out those doors and they turn back and say, 80% of my faculty were amazing. And they thought about me as a student. They made me learn to the 100% of my ability. So we have to give it our best. And I hope that every leader at a university is thinking about what's best for their students. And then my final thing is really thinking about the sponsorship of those women faculty members and those students, and being able to introduce them to the people that have the power currently, advocate for them when they're not in the room. And what more do you want than the proof of your institution's mark on these faculty, having the most acclaimed faculty across men and women, and having the most prominent students who have been successful because your university invested in them at 100%.
Yeah. I'm going to add one more to that, if I may.
Sure.
And that is the leadership development plans.
Yes.
Having a plan, having a pipeline for all faculty, everybody that you hire, man, women, minorities, whatever.
Yeah.
What's the plan? How are you going to ensure their success going forward? If you open the doors and you give them the tools, it's up to them to walk through. Nobody's going to hand it to them on a platter.
Yeah.
But if you make it easier for them and you get away from this, well, I had to go through this, so why can't you? That's not productive.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition, because I mentioned pipeline as that number one. But if you do go out and you recruit, just like you don't want them to all show up and then you're on your own. You are recruiting them to intentionally continue that investment as they move into those higher ranks. So absolutely, I agree with you, Drum.
So what's next for you?
Oh, Forte, we're so busy. We've got lots of things going on. We are looking at how to build out our representation on college campuses. That's so important to us. We have about 65 university partners, and we are trying to connect with students on all of those campuses to learn more about what college women are looking for in terms of their own leadership journey and their own career opportunities. And so really, we've done a lot of work in the MBA space and getting more women into the MBA. We're not trying to get more women into university, but we are really trying to think about what are those opportunities they're setting themselves up for, and making sure that when they graduate, they're gainfully employed, they're making the right wage, and that they see a future for themselves in a leadership position. And so we want to help them get that.
Well, this is great. Alyssa, thank you so much for being on the program. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and look forward to it again in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to our guest, Alyssa Sangster, and for her sharing her insights on how to create an environment that supports aspiring female and minority leaders at higher education institutions. Our next guest is Dr. Andrew Korisic, Executive Director of the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges and Associate Professor of Higher Education at Appalachian State Universities. Andrew's focus is Rural Serving Institutions, RSIs, and he'll be joining us to talk about RSIs, their impact on their communities, and lessons that RSIs can teach other higher education institutions.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.